Hi everybody and good afternoon. We're going to do a Q&A here that's going to be streamed on multiple channels here. We're going to be on Fox Weather Live and we're going to be on Facebook as well as on YouTube. So if you have a question, please put a Q in front of your question. Something about the tropics, something about Hurricane Ian, something about the tropical system that's trying to form down in the Caribbean. We're taking all questions here. Pedro, I see your comment. I'll get back to you. Hi everybody, if you're just joining, so we'll be live here obviously in just under 3 minutes taking your questions. If you have any questions, any specific questions, put a Q in front if you would. It just helps me sort them out about anything related to Hurricane Ian, related to the system down in the Caribbean, whatever you're interested in. That's what we're here to talk about. Hi Joe, yeah, thanks. Neighborhood Weather was one of the most fun things I ever did in my life. And of course, working with Ann was just one of those moments in a lifetime. She was such an amazing news person and an amazing person. Actually, you know what, folks? We're going to get started here on the stream a little bit early because, I don't know, somehow I must have goofed up the time. Because we're going to join Fox Weather live here in just a moment, and we'll be live on Fox Weather and on YouTube, and we're taking your questions. So let me just pause right now while we join them. Hi, Ian and Bridget, and thanks for joining in the stream here this afternoon. So we're live this afternoon on Fox Weather on my Facebook page and on the Fox Weather Facebook page, as well as on the Fox Weather YouTube page. So we're asking anybody that has a question about anything in the tropics. We're going to talk here about this potential tropical cyclone 13. Don't you hate the name? But that's the official name. We'll talk about that first, and then we have plenty of time to talk about Ian or anything else you want to talk about in the tropics. So first of all, let's get to what's going on there right now, because everybody, when they hear that this is forecast to be a hurricane, everybody is like, oh no. It's in the Caribbean, in a similar place where the whole Ian thing started, right? Well, yes and no. It's actually farther south. So by the time the system that became Ian got near here, these ABC islands, Aruba, Bonaire, and Curacao, it was farther north. It had already gone farther north up here, and it was beginning that turn to the north. So this is farther south. The weather pattern is different. This is not coming to Florida. We're totally confident about that. So I want everybody in Florida to relax and not worry about this. We have reason to be very concerned about our friends in Nicaragua and in Honduras and maybe even in El Salvador, the people that were so hard hit in 2020 by back-to-back hurricanes in November. If you remember Hurricane Eta and Hurricane Iota, it was unbelievable that they got hit by these incredible storms. This one currently is not forecast to be as strong as those, but we can't totally rule that out. So it's called Potential Tropical Cyclone 13. If you replace this word cyclone by threat, I think it's clear what it is. It's a potential tropical threat. It's not yet a tropical depression, doesn't have a circulation like a tropical depression has to have, and it's not yet a tropical storm, but it has the potential to be those. So they actually have watches and warnings up because of that potential. So there is some hint on the radar coming out of Curacao that there's a circulation about in there. So the Hurricane Center is sort of nominally picking that for a place to put the low pressure system. But on the satellite picture, it kind of looks like the turning is down here more. Those things don't always line up. There are mountains involved. And we look close up where the model analyzes this. You see it kind of has turning up in here. But then when it gets over this kind of hilly terrain and some mountains down here in the northern coast of Venezuela, the winds go all kind of wonky as they do over hilly terrain. So the system has some little chance when it gets over here closer to Colombia of intensifying, but it's going to have a hard time doing much while all this landmass is involved here. But because it could intensify before it gets to the Guajira Peninsula there, this is Colombia now, Guajira Peninsula in Colombia, they put up a tropical storm warning just in case it does intensify with winds above 40 miles an hour. And in this hilly terrain down there, this can be quite dangerous with heavy rain and mudslides, much more than the wind. And they're going to get real tropical squalls across Aruba and Curacao and Bonaire, which is pretty unusual for them. This system is very, very far south. It's very unusual to have a system this well developed this far south in the Caribbean. And then farther to the west, there are hurricane watches for Providencia and San Andres. And there's actually another little island right up in there called Santa Catalina. They're Colombian islands, but the hurricane watch is up because the system, once it gets over the Caribbean, has a pretty good chance of intensifying, and it might intensify significantly. Those are mountainous islands. There's plenty of high ground. We're not worried about the people not being able to get away from the storm surge and so forth there, but they are right in the path of a potential significant hurricane. So here is the track here for the next 2 days. So you see, the idea is that in that body of water, it has a chance of making it to 40 miles an hour. That would make it Tropical Storm Julia. The other system, by the way, on the other side of the Atlantic, that Tropical Depression 12 should die out soon. That's not going to be a factor here. So then finally, it looks like on Friday, it's going to clear South America here and move away from the Colombian coast. And all indications are there's a good chance that this is going to develop. The only thing I can imagine that would get in the way is if somehow the circulation, instead of being up here, actually ends up being down here somewhere, and it gets all torn up in this higher terrain. But we'll see. Right now, the models don't say that. The computer forecast models all keep it north and intensify it as it moves to the west. So then it moves farther west, and you see over this very warm water. This is south of where Ian intensified now, because Ian, remember, turned kind of up into here and came into Cuba. So this is still very, very warm water, very conducive to strengthening. See, the Hurricane Center has 60 miles an hour, 70 miles an hour, up to about 85 miles an hour at landfall, Category 1. Of course, you always plan for a Category 2, and there are models that intensify it significantly more than that. So along the Nicaraguan coast, they need to be preparing. And of course, this is very mountainous. Nicaragua and Honduras are very mountainous. Over to El Salvador and even Guatemala, they're going to get some moisture from this. So that's always one of the big hazards in Central America when a storm makes landfall, besides the coastal effects, is in the mountains and the very heavy rain. It is expected to die out here. The remnants may either drift around or move off toward the Pacific. We'll see models generally kind of keep it drifting around. You see the GFS model here kind of takes it up, dies it out, and kind of turns it like that. But this is a very weak kind of nothing system. The consensus is very strong that it's going to head into Nicaragua, and as I'll show you in a moment, really no concern for it turning north. Now, the most reliable one of the models you can see on the internet is the consensus model. If you're looking at the little details on the internet, it's called TVCN or TVCA, and that's an average of the most important models, the best performing models. That average is always better than any individual model. So whenever somebody asks me, what's your favorite model, what do you look at, I always say, I depend on the consensus model, as does the National Hurricane Center. And when we're looking at models, that's the best. But bottom line is, I look at the National Hurricane Center forecast. All right, now what is different about this than in the Ian situation? Well, there's the dip in the jet stream that we had with Ian, but it's a very different kind of dip. If you remember, Ian kind of dipped down farther south and grabbed Ian and scooped it north. This is not going to do that. This is very flat, and this also has this high pressure underneath of it. And it's the high pressure that's going to drive the potential tropical cyclone, which is really just a tropical disturbance, on off to the west. And the high pressure actually goes west with it. So this is going to just block any kind of northward movement, and exactly the nature of the flow there and the high pressure, that's what's going to dictate exactly where the center of the storm ends up, with the idea that it'll probably be a hurricane very close to the Nicaraguan coast if it just kind of intensifies as forecast. So that's the bottom line on the new system that'll most likely continue to be this potential tropical cyclone 13, just a tropical disturbance until it clears the coast enough to develop into a tropical depression or a tropical storm. It's forecast to develop into Tropical Storm Julia. All right, so obviously the thing that's on our minds is Hurricane Ian and the horrific situation over on the West Coast. So let me get to some of your questions here. As I said, if you could put a Q in front of the questions, that helps me find from people that are just wanting to say hello or just telling me where they are, to somebody that has a question about the tropics. So just put a Q first. But let me just answer a couple of them about some specific locations, because here's, for instance, Vivian here in Bradenton, Sarasota, Longboat Key area. This is not going to bother you at all. So just to reinforce that, the system that is down in the Caribbean is not coming to Florida. It's not going to affect the Florida weather at all. So I'm not saying that hurricane season is done. As a matter of fact, our friends in New York at Fox Weather asked the question, what about hurricane season and the rest of hurricane season? Appreciate that, guys. What can we expect? Well, the odds say there's going to be more to hurricane season. October is on average the most likely month to have a hurricane in Florida. Now, generally the strongest hurricanes come in September, but October more come, and the reason they come is because they come out of the Caribbean, kind of like Ian did, in one fashion or the other. They come out of the Caribbean and they somehow turn to the north and turn back, or something like that. I didn't mean to aim that right at Fort Myers or anything, but it's in some fashion they come from the south and then tend to turn to the right for the same reason that Ian turned to the right. Of course, Ian was right toward the end of September, but it was kind of an October sort of weather pattern. Remember, there was a cold front involved, and that's what dumped all that rain in North Florida and so forth. So anyway, we had just a October-ish sort of weather pattern involved there. So is Florida? So Marcia asks, is Florida out of trouble for the time being? The answer to that is 100% yes. Nothing is coming to Florida. Please comment on the rain threat for Belize. Well, Diane, Belize has the potential for rain. It looks like the core of this is going to be farther south, but it's not 100% sure that it's not, as it kind of dies out over land, going to come toward Belize. So you need to stay in touch with the Met Service, the weather service in Belize, and as they forecast the rain, they're very, very good at it. And they'll keep you up to date as we track the rain. It's a little too early to tell how much effect it's going to have in Belize, but there is a potential for significant rain in Belize. Let's see. Maria, this is again about the islands of Colombia, San Andres and Providencia. So you are right in line here. Of course, a hurricane watch is issued, as I said, but you are right in the potential track of this thing. So hurricane, you've got a ways to go. The storm isn't going to get there until the weekend. So, we can look at this tomorrow and see if it stays right on track and see how the intensification process happens. But it's likely that your hurricane plans are going to have to be put in effect there on the island, and you're going to have to be sure you're on high ground and so forth. Those are beautiful islands, and occasionally they get these kind of low latitude hurricanes that come through there. Let me see. Are the ocean waters getting any cooler yet? Carolyn asked. Well, not really in the Caribbean. Ocean waters in the north are getting cooler, but the reason that we have these hurricanes in October that come out of the Caribbean is because the Caribbean waters are so warm, and the weather pattern in the Caribbean is still conducive. The waters are still actually warm all across the tropical Atlantic, but they're essentially summertime warm in the Caribbean and in the Gulf, and we don't until cold fronts start coming down and start cooling the Gulf, but the cold fronts don't make it to the Caribbean, so you have summertime warmth there, so you have all this energy, and then the weather pattern tends to make the eastern Atlantic be quite hostile to hurricanes, but it's because of the weather pattern, not because of the water temperatures so much. And the Caribbean waters, if you go to Aruba in the wintertime, you're still swimming in the ocean there. The waters are still fairly warm, and they only start cooling a bit when you get these big cold fronts moving down to the south. So how accurate was the consensus model for Ian, and how many days out? Well, generally, the cone that the National Hurricane Center, as the issue for Ian, they put the consensus about down the middle of the cone. But the consensus is the average of the models. So if the models start moving around like they did with Ian for a variety of reasons, and I guess I should talk about those reasons, but then the consensus, they don't jump right on the consensus. So if suddenly all the models turn one way, all go to the left, then the consensus is going to go to the left because it is the average of the models. and they're dispersive, right? The models go all different directions, but the Hurricane Center won't jump the cone to the left. They'll okay, we're going to move it a little to the left, because sometimes we've seen that the models go to the left and they go back to the right. And so we don't want to jump on it all at once. So that's the procedure, and that's what they did. And that's why at this time on Saturday, these days, there are so many days, but at this time, let me take the question off there. At this time on Saturday that you're seeing here on the screen, the models, as I recall, were farther to the left. The consensus was farther to the left, but the Hurricane Center wasn't completely biting on that. And then if they stay to the left and they stay to the left, then they'll eventually move the cone there. Now, so what we have here with the cone is a complicated problem, because when the cone is far out, so here we are on Saturday. This was the cone 11 a.m. on Saturday. So remember that the landfall in Fort Myers was about 3 p.m. on Wednesday. So that's Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. That's more than 4 days out. Well, more than 4 days out, the cone is very wide. And so it encompassed essentially the whole state of Florida. So what should have happened on Saturday is that everybody on the West Coast the discussion should have started, and in the Panhandle should have started, what are we going to do next week if a hurricane comes our way, if this potentially strong hurricane comes our way? Because if you remember, this was forecast to be strong from the beginning. And what seemed to happen is, as it went forward in time, this idea of being in and out of the cone became lodged in the minds of decision makers and many people. And since the cone shifted north and then shifted back south, during that shifting north process, they went kind of, this is not going to bother us. But that wasn't good thinking, because when the cone gets narrower as you get down here in time, so it kind of puts a spotlight on a part of the coast, and that spotlight is unwarranted because the bad weather is in a large area around the storm, much bigger than the cone. So, it's really disappointing that this happened, because this dialogue about the bad weather being outside the cone has been an ongoing dialogue. And I hope that with all these people that died and all these people that were confused about including decision makers, key decision makers in the state of Florida, got confused about the cone, and that's really bad. And I hope that what comes out of this is at least a better understanding that bad weather occurs well outside the cone, and the National Hurricane Center warns about that, and they put up warnings and detailed information, and that's the information that counts. Don't just look at the cone is the bottom line. But that was a very good question about the consensus model. Thank you. Will this one too be slow moving? No, this one is moving along. This is Maria again, who's in those islands that are in the way of the system. That's not Ian now. This is the system down in the Caribbean. Maria, this one is moving along at a pretty good clip, and unlike Ian, twice as fast as Ian, a little more than twice as fast, but it is going to slow down as it approaches Providencia and Santa Catalina and San Andres. So it'll be a little slower, but still, this is going to move right along. This is not going to be a crawling storm like we had with Ian. Debbie says, I read the Hurricane Center considering eliminating the central line of the cone. Is that true? Well, yes, there's been a lot of talk about this. So when I first created the cone back in the 90s, there was no central line. And as a matter of fact, at Fox Weather, we don't put a center line, although if the storm is well offshore and not affecting land, we'll put the icons down the middle because it doesn't confuse anybody. But when it's near land, we never indicate anything but this is a threat area across the cone. And by the way, there are watches and warnings outside the cone, including, in the case of Ian, storm surge watches and then storm surge warnings for storm surge 4 to 7 feet over top of islands that are only 2 or 3 feet above sea level. And the storm surge is above the high tide level, not just above sea level. So, if the information had been digested, I just can't believe that people would have stayed on islands if they knew the water could come. Even at the beginning, before the storm surge forecasts were 12 feet, 15 feet, 16 feet, like that. Even when they were up to 7 feet, I just can't believe that people, if they really understood that, would have stayed on those islands. So I know there's some talk there. Some people just won't leave. Some people just won't, they're going to stay. There's nothing we can do about that. I just think there's a lot more we can do to be sure that people are making decisions based on information and not on just intuition, or not on the cone alone, which is the main question. Patrick asks, what do you think the chances are for Southwest Florida to get hit again with a significant hurricane? It doesn't look much like Patrick in the picture, does it? But who's ever asking me the question there? So, there's just no way to know. Like I said, October is the most likely month in Florida to have a hurricane. Doesn't mean you can't have a hurricane other places as well. Look at Hurricane Sandy late in October. Obviously went all the way up to New Jersey and New York in the Northeast. So things can happen. We can't really predict more than a week to 10 days at the most. Let's say a week to be sure. There's nothing that looks like it's pending besides the system in the Caribbean right now. But there's a week from now, we're to the middle of October. We still have the rest of October to go. It's not out of the question that you get a hurricane in November, although it's rare. The only real hurricane in November hit Miami, actually, in November, but it came from the north and it was a freak kind of thing. It wasn't one of those southern type hurricanes. Let's see. Question is this PTC 13, that's that disturbance called Potential Tropical Cyclone 13, going to survive land when it becomes a tropical storm? Well, I think it probably will. All indications it will. Like I said, if it ends up developing over land and gets mauled by the higher elevations in Venezuela and Colombia, then, maybe not. But all indications, all the computer models say, yes, it will become a tropical storm, and some models make it a very strong hurricane. Here's a question from the Caribbean. Thank you for such good coverage. Appreciate that very much. How does it look for Jamaica? Well, this storm is going to stay well south of Jamaica. I don't think you're going to have any significant problem with it in Jamaica. I thought more folks would ask about Ian, tell you the truth, but here's a question about will any tropical storm hit New York anymore? If you mean by anymore, ever, absolutely. There's been tropical storms and hurricanes in New York since way back. The hurricane of record in New York was in 1821, and there have been hurricanes ever since. Obviously, there was Sandy, which was not much of a windstorm, but of course was a horrible storm surge event. Let me see who else is on today. Let me tell you what, I'm going to take the Q off because not everybody puts a Q in front of their questions. All right, here's a question from Honduras. See, I'm in Honduras now, and I survived Eta and Iota, and there was extreme flooding. I think this is going to be downplayed. This is not going to the U.S. Trinidad was completely flooded. Yes, it was. It was exceptional. This storm is really unusual because it is so far south, so it's affecting places that don't get this tremendous core of tropical moisture, and Trinidad is one of them. Trinidad is right above the Venezuelan coast. So I hope in Honduras, and I'm sure in Honduras and Nicaragua, they're going to play this up because, yes, this is a significant flooding threat for Honduras. I was in Honduras after Hurricane Mitch, and it was just stunning and unbelievable. Let's see. Who else is on today? Okay, let's see. Directly from the NHC forecast, 3 to 6 inches of rain possible and tropical storm force gusts. Yes, there's heavy rain with this system. Okay, here's one about the cone. These are the questions I kind of thought you guys would have today. I know there's been a lot of confusion with the forecast cone and talk about it being unexpected hit for Southwest Florida. Can you explain the probability that the center of the hurricane will track down the center of the cone versus the outer edges? So yes, there is a higher probability, but here's how you have to think about this, I think. Why do we wear seatbelts? We don't wear seatbelts because we know if we don't, we're going to get injured or killed when we get in the car. There's a low chance that we're going to get in an accident, but because the consequences are terrible, we wear the seatbelts, right? So when the consequences are so terrible for getting a direct hit from a significant hurricane, the odds are not really important because low odds and high consequences is still a terrible thing. So that's why with a big hurricane, we don't talk about, it's a better chance if it goes down that it goes down the center than goes down the side. But just like Hurricane Charlie in 2004, it went down the side of the cone, and there was all this surprise and angst. But unfortunately, it was so long ago that the decision makers of today didn't remember those lessons from Hurricane Charlie, and that's the problem. So you're correct from a pure odds standpoint for one forecast. The odds are higher if it near the center of the cone, not right down the center, but near the center, and they diminish as you get to the side. But only 2/3 of the time it stays within the cone. 1/3 of the time it goes outside the cone. So many bad things can happen outside the cone. And remember that the center, in this case, the center was in the cone, but the catastrophic weather was just outside the cone because the storm is kind of right side loaded. So I just hope that we get past the cone as a result of this horrendous situation that happened in Southwest Florida, that bad weather will always be outside the cone, and the stronger the storm, the more outside the cone is going to be. All right, guys, on Fox Weather, let me send it back to you. All right, on our streaming here, let me just check to be sure to see if I've covered the questions that you have. Is this potential tropical cyclone thing in the Caribbean getting steered by? And yes, it's a blocking high pressure system. If you missed the beginning here, I talked about that. In fact, you know what? I might be able to. Let's see if I can go back. Sometimes when I go back, yes, look at that. I'm going to take your question off, and I can show you here. You see this blocking high pressure system on top of it. So the dip in the jet stream is not a sharp dip like it was during Ian. And as the system moves forward and toward Nicaragua, the high pressure system is going to build over build to the west and block it from coming north and drive it into Central America. We have high confidence about that. If you missed what I said at the beginning, this storm is not coming to Florida. That's for absolute sure. Let me just double check before I wrap up here. So this is an interesting question. Janine says complacency was in effect with Ian. Well, to some degree, I think that's true. I mean, Southwest Florida, one of the issues in the Fort Myers area, the Naples area, is there hasn't been a hurricane direct hit there in quite some time. And there was Irma in 2017, which, was kind of supposed to be a lot worse than it was because it ended up going just inland instead of going just offshore. If it had gone just offshore, there would have been big storm surge over those islands, these same islands in Irma. So I don't think it was complacency as much as it was lack of knowledge and poor distribution of information. I just believe that if the local officials there had gone on local media and television, social media and everything 4 or 5 days before and said, okay, folks, we are in a threat zone here. Let's talk about what the threat could be, and what we need to be thinking about. And we need to be thinking about evacuations, because if this storm starts looking like it's coming toward us, then we got to evacuate, because we live in the most storm surge prone, dangerous place on the whole hurricane coast. We have more people in harm's way here than anywhere else. So let's start thinking about it. And that should have started Friday, and then Saturday, and then Sunday. And then when they got that forecast on Sunday of a 60% chance of 6 feet of water over islands that are only 2 or 3 feet high, that should have started the process, and should have been a step-by-step thing. So I don't know. I just don't think that I gotta give people more credit. If the people that I've seen generally said, no, the evacuation just came too late, and I couldn't react in time. They weren't set up to. So what you have to do with evacuation, you have to get people ready to do it, and then eventually, when the time comes, you get them ready mentally, and then you tell them to prepare to evacuate in case they have to, and then you say, okay, we have to. And, so it's a 3-step thing, and they went right to we have to, and that didn't work in New York City in Sandy, and unfortunately, the folks in Southwest Florida seems like they didn't learn from that, from what happened in Sandy and other storms, and they got blinded by the cone. Seems like, that's what it looks like to me. And they still talk about the cone, but we were out of the cone. No, you had a warning. You were specifically warned. So if you're in Southwest Florida, don't let them tell you, start talking about the cone. That's just not the reality of the issue. Okay, let's see. Here's a question about Maria, very in Wellington. I don't know why I keep picking your tweets. We live in Wellington. Nearest beach is 12 miles away. Sense of false security that we're safe from surges. Yes, you're safe from surges, but you're not safe from flooding. So the way South Florida, all of South Florida is set up, the highest ground is over where Henry Flagler built the railroad tracks 120 some years ago in the 1890s. And that's the high ground. And then it goes down toward the beach, or down toward Lake Worth in the case of Palm Beach County, and it goes down to the west. And that was all Everglades out there. And so the water, if it rains hard, if you were to get the rain, for instance, like they had in North Florida with Ian, that would all flood. And it would be flooded for a long, long time. So that's the issue in Wellington, and that's the issue here's the same question about West Broward. So would West Broward have flooded as badly with Ian coming from the east of Fort Lauderdale? Well, West Broward floods from heavy rain, not from storm surge. Now, the eastern part of Broward, downtown Fort Lauderdale, and all the islands there in the eastern part of Fort Lauderdale and in the eastern part of Hollywood, that's all storm surge. So the water gets forced from the ocean. If it was a storm like Ian, it would have been forced over the beaches, into the intracoastal, up the rivers, and so forth. But in West Broward, that's all rainfall. And so in West Broward, you should be, and West Dade and Western Palm Beach County should be thinking about what happened to the folks up and around Orlando and up outside Daytona Beach, where they had that tremendous rainfall, and the water still hasn't drained. And it's going down, but there's still flooding around those rivers there. Well, that would be the case around the drainage canals in the western part of the county. If we had rainfall in that 2 feet, 30-inch range, this happened in Irene in 1999, and we had 14 inches of rain, I think. Anyway, when we have these big rain amounts, it just floods badly there, and it takes a long time for that water to drain. So that's the issue in West Broward. Let me see. Anybody else? This was there are questions about Andrew here. My Andrew folks from Homestead. Here's a question about what about flooding on the St. John's at Jacksonville and north? Well, the St. John's, has the St. John's even peaked So the St. Johns River goes from Jacksonville and then south, but the water flows from the south to the north, and there are all these other rivers. I'm not familiar with the Trout River, but I'm sure that's one of those rivers that feeds into the St. Johns. So all that water that's on the land eventually drains down in one of those feeder rivers into the St. John's, and then all that water has to go north and go out through Jacksonville to get out to the ocean. And it takes a long time. So that's why all that process is still underway as the water off the land slowly gets into the lower elevations and slowly moves to the north. If you're near the St. Johns River, you know how high that river is. And by the way, here in Miami, if you see the canals out along Okeechobee Road out by the Miami International Airport, they're very, very high because the water that's in Central Florida that gets into the Kissimmee River, so Lake Okeechobee in the middle of the state. Unfortunately, it's not on my map here, but Lake Okeechobee, of course, the huge lake in the state, the river to the north of that is the Kissimmee River. So any rain that falls into the Kissimmee River basin flows into Lake Okeechobee and then flows south. And that water, some of it goes down in the Everglades. I mean, they're trying to get more and more water to go into the Everglades. And then and then other water comes down the canals that actually drain out through the southeast Florida counties. So those canals are very high. So, all right, let me end with this because this is not a question, it's a comment. Let's face it, you guys blew it. Well, here's the thing, is if people think that it's just bad, because it's not the case. The science that we have of forecasting hurricanes is so good now that it allows us to generate watches and warnings that are very detailed well in advance. So what kind of blew it is the cone. And like I said, I created the cone way back in the day in the 1990s. And then the Hurricane Center started using it in 2002. And then over time it shrunk because forecasts have gotten better. So the cone in the modern system is not the hurricane forecast. It's the warnings that are the forecast. Like we had warnings in the Keys for storm surge and we had warnings for wind because they got wind at 40 miles an hour and they got storm surge, but it wasn't in the cone. So what we have to do is we have to get people shifted off of this myopic view of the cone and on to who's being warned, what are the threats, what is the science saying the threats are over what area, regardless of the cone. There's always going to be around the cone, but it can be 50, 100 miles outside of the cone that is still in the threat zone. So the question needs to be, what is the threat zone? Not what does the cone show? Because they can be different in a large, strong hurricane. In a small hurricane, very often the cone and the threat zone are very close to the same. But in a large hurricane that's very strong, they're always very different. And the threat zone is always a long way outside of the cone. So it's a complicated subject. I just hope that we didn't go through all this, and those poor people in Southwest Florida that stayed and let alone died didn't go through all that, and we didn't learn better to not just look at the cone. So I'll see you on Fox Weather this afternoon. I'll see you tomorrow, and I'll be back here, and I'm going to have a post about this, a text post about this, that you'll see on Facebook tomorrow. So everybody have a good night, and I hope you stay safe, and let's see if we can educate everybody about how the information flows and how we can use it the next time we have a storm. Have a good night, everybody.